Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Chandrani and I have the pleasure to be your MC today. Welcome to this afternoon's ISAS panel discussion on the topic Indian Budget 2016 and the Indian Economy. The discussion will be chaired by Mr. Vinod Rai, Visiting Senior Research Fellow, Institute of South Asian Studies and the 11th Comptroller and Auditor-General of the Government of India. I would now like to introduce our distinguished panelists on stage. First, Dr. Jahangir Aziz, Head of EM Asia Economic Research, JP Morgan Bank. Mr. Vikram Khanna, Associate Director, The Business Times, Singapore Press Holdings. Mr. Rohan Solapurkar, Tax Partner at Deloitte, Singapore. And Dr. Amitendu Palit, Research Lead, Trade and Economics Program and Senior Research Fellow, Institute of South Asian Studies. Now, I will invite Mr. Vinod Rai to give his opening remarks.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon to you all, and thank you very much for coming to this event which is being launched by ISAS on the Budget 2016 and the Indian economy. It's exceedingly interesting the way excitement builds up to the Indian budget. Not only a media hype, there is a hype kind of going all over the place. 7 days, 10 days, much in advance of the budget, people start discussing, is it going to be fiscal consolidation, is it going to be growth, is it going to be pro-poor, pro-farmer, what else? And people start taking their positions on each of these. 24/7 media, of course, has made up that hype all the more interesting. You almost don't believe that it's an annual exercise. One gets to feel that it's one event which is occurring once in a leap year. This happens to be a leap year, that's a different aspect altogether. But the build-up is very much there. 24/7 has contributed to it all the more. In the current year, of course, there was a huge amount of speculation. Is it going to be the budget which will lead to fiscal consolidation? Or will it be a growth-oriented budget? Or will it lead to kind of more poll prospects that the ruling party is going to see for itself, not in 2019, but in state level politics, which is to follow in the current year as well as next year. There was a great deal of interest, India-centric interest. India is considered to be one of those growing economies, emerging economies in this area, and the event has passed. What do the pundits make of it? Just to give you two positions. One position given by the former Finance Minister, Mr. Chidambaram. He said there is no big idea in the budget. One virtue of the budget is that it has left every section of people equally disappointed. This budget is a wasted opportunity. Very predictable. Then what does the government spokesperson say? Maybe the finance minister, the Minister of State for Finance, maybe the Prime Minister himself. The budget is pro-poor, pro-farmer, pro-village. India is poised to be a roaring tiger. Now, I don't know how that's a positive interpretation, but anyway, there is everything for everyone, for each one, and for every sector in this budget. So obviously, these are two extreme positions. Budget obviously must be somewhere in between a median or an average or whatever you take out of it. What was the behavior of the markets? Indian markets, those of you who know them better, are quite unpredictable. While the budget speech was being read, the Sensex fell 500 points. Next day, surged 777, highest in a day. The day after, 464 points, and today it's, I think, about 24,800, thereabouts. So, has seen, given it a kind of a welcome signal in some ways. Rupee is at a high gain, it's come to about 67.654 as of yesterday. Now, what was the general scenario in which the finance minister was presenting the budget. Firstly, India had faced 2 consecutive drought years, where agrarian economy largely dependent upon monsoon for agriculture, so poor agricultural growth, rural distress. A large number of infrastructure projects, roads, power, which were stuck for various reasons. Then there was a global adverse economic business environment, poor export demand, and restricted liquidity in the markets, banks facing stress. Now, that was the situation that the finance minister was facing, and what was he, when he presented the budget, what were his claims? First, that GDP has grown at 7.6% as compared to the previous of 6.3%. The inflation, the CPI inflation, is at 5.4% as compared to 9.4% in the previous years. And he is sticking to the FRBM figure of 3.5% of GDP for 16-17, and has succeeded in reducing the absolute deficit by 21,745 crore rupees. We use crore rupees for ease. And even from the RE figure, the absolute reduction in the absolute deficit is 1,186 crore rupees, which is a fairly substantial commitment. The CAD, current account deficit, has declined from $18.4 billion to $14.4 billion, which was roughly 1.4% of the GDP. And the foreign exchange reserves stood at $350 billion. Now, the other situation facing the finance minister was that the Finance Commission has announced its recommendations, which is reducing the centre's state of taxes from 68% to 58%. Added burden of the Pay Commission, which is not being totally accepted as yet, but the government is bound to accept it in the ensuing fiscal year, and the one rank, one pay pension commitment of the defense services. Now, various kinds of commitments are being made. The fact that we will have to accelerate growth if we have to achieve these objectives, and what does the budget then have for us? Obviously, there is no big bang announcement. It's not what was commonly referred to long time back as a dream budget. So what does the budget have for us? Now, it is obviously eschewed also any grandstanding or any headline grabbing announcements. Now, farm and rural sector certainly has been given a fillip. 5 lakh acres to be brought under irrigation. Insurance scheme with minimum premium for maximum coverage for farmers. Huge amount of rural roads, Gramin roads as they are called. Rural drinking water and rural irrigation, both being provided adequate amount of devolutions. Mandi towns and trading of on these. More importantly, direct benefit transfers to rural consumption, which will ensure that there is no leakage in that. The other announcement or the commitment or the plus point that the government seems to be looking for is infrastructure. Claims to have provided 2,21,246 crores in the budget on all the infrastructure sectors, road plus rail plus power plus shipping, and the increase is 32% as against 23% which was provided last time. These require a certain amount of policy changes, and those policy changes have also been recommended. There is a reference to creating of a grievance redressal mechanism for public-private partnership projects and a separate credit rating for infrastructure projects. Banking, which I mentioned earlier, which was under stress, some announcements. Of course, it's very disappointing that the recapitalization amount is only rupees 25,000 crores. 70,000 crores had been indicated earlier, but that was for a 4-year period. Current year, only 25,000 has been provided, which is certainly very disappointing. But the budget talks about initiatives to promote corporate bond markets, improve governance of public sector banking. There's a hint of consolidation in it, a possible bankruptcy code for banks. Then asset reconstruction companies would be supported, and there is a hint that the IDBI bank may be the thin edge of the wedge. Let's hope it's the thin edge of the wedge. The share of government's stakeholding will decline below 50%. And that will certainly be a good augury because that releases so much of capital. Aadhaar, the UIDAI, is to be given a statutory basis, and if that really comes about, a huge amount of leakage can be avoided. Now, the task is to balance between fiscal prudence on one side and growth acceleration on the other in the face of all these announcements, the Finance Commission, the Pay Commission, etc., and stick to the figure of 3.5%. The Finance Minister has announced an increase in spending of 10.8%. But if he has to stick to his 3.5%, he has to increase revenue by about 1.6 trillion rupees. Now, this is the most ambitious part of the budget. What is the maths? What is the arithmetic behind which he says he will increase spending, he will make all these devolutions, and yet maintain his figure of 3.5% in the FRBM as a part of the fiscal deficit. Now, to explain the maths, we have an excellent panel before us today, and each of them are experts in the fields, and I think we will go with Jahangir first. Jahangir is the head of the Asia Research, Economic Research of JP Morgan Bank. We have Vikram take on. Vikram is from the Business Standard. Rohan is a tax expert with Deloitte, and we have Dr. Amitendu Palit from the ISAS itself. We were supposed to be having Mr. Manu Bhaskaran from the Centennial group. Fortunately, he had a medical emergency at home, because of which he has not been able to come. So to unravel all these mysteries from the budget, I call upon Dr. Jahangir Aziz to make his first presentation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rai. I have to apologize for my bad throat. And thank you, Isis, for inviting me once again after last year. So there is this R.K. Lakshman cartoon, which I think was in the 1980s, where there is R.K. Lakshman's used to use this person called the common man. When the common man opens the door and he sees the newspaper on that day, it says the budget, and he turns around and tells his wife, "Oh, good, another budget. Now I know how well I did last year." So the budget is like that, and as Mr. Rai pointed out, it's almost like a circus every year. But at the end of the day, it does affect 1.2 billion people, whether we like it or not, and therefore the attention has to be given to it. Last year when I was here, and we had a panel, and almost everyone was going almost gaga over the budget, and I was perhaps, or you would probably vouch for, I was probably the only voice who was very skeptical about it. And my skepticism came from the same reason why today I'm extremely supportive of the budget. Mr. Vinod Rai said it wasn't a dream budget. It wasn't. But it was an extremely bold budget, because the kind of pressures that the government was under to violate the fiscal deficit and keep increasing expenditure to support growth was intense. So just to take you back as to why last year's budget was not only problematic, but last year's fiscal management was extremely problematic. So last year, the budget was 3.9% target. If you recall, in 2013, when India was facing this almost was a near crisis and balance of payments. At that time, the finance minister, Mr. Chidambaram, talked about a fiscal consolidation path, whereby every year the deficit would be cut down by 0.5 percentage point. So in terms of the original consolidation path, the budget deficit last year meaning the year ending March this year, was supposed to have been 3.5% of GDP. And the government last year basically made the argument that global growth is slow, we don't really see demand going around, corporate investment isn't picking up, so government needs to push for public investment, and therefore we will, for 1 year, we will violate the consolidation path, and instead of 3.5, we will go for 3.9% fiscal deficit, but next year, which is this year, we will stick to 3.5%. Now think about what happened last year. Last year was the biggest single windfall gain India ever received. Oil fell from $110 per barrel to $30 a barrel. This should have been the biggest factor that should have driven growth to unbelievable levels. The government should have. There was not even in question of subsidizing oil anymore. Government could have actually been money on oil. Inflation should have dropped off, and growth should have skyrocketed. Instead, even if you leave the growth numbers, which is doubtful, growth simply moved from around 7.2% to 7.6%. And that's with a large grain and perhaps even a sack of salt will take those numbers. If you look at diesel prices in Delhi, diesel price today in Delhi is about 52, 53 rupees a litre. The equivalent of that is about, in terms of crude oil, is about $68, $69 a barrel. Oil price today is at $30 a barrel. So what exactly is happening to this gap between $68 a barrel, at which diesel prices pegged, retail diesel prices pegged in India, versus the $30 a barrel at which ONGC and everybody else is buying oil? It's a huge number. It's almost like $37, $38 a barrel. All of that has been pocketed by the government in terms of higher excise taxes. Excise taxes have been increased relentlessly. So much so that if you look at FY16 budget and if you add the drop in oil subsidies plus the excise taxes that the government received, it's about 0.9% of GDP. So the government starts off by saying, I can't meet 3.5, instead I'm going to meet 3.9, and on top of that, it receives about 0.9% of GDP of windfall gains from falling oil prices. The budget deficit, as Mr. Rai pointed out, in this year is going to be 3.9% of GDP. So what exactly did the government do with it? The government did pass on some of it, about 0.3, so about a third of this windfall gain, to the states in the form of higher transfers. It did a little bit of increase in capital spending. Roads were the biggest beneficiary of it. And the rest, it simply offset it by not privatizing. The privatization budget last year was about 65,000 crores, roughly about 0.5% of GDP. We barely made it to 12,500 crores. So in other words, this year's budget, the year ending March 2016, year's fiscal management was one where there is a windfall gain that takes place. The government does not pass on that windfall gain to the households, i.e. inflation does not fall as much as it should have fallen, i.e. Reserve Bank of India doesn't cut interest rate as much as it could have done. And all that we get out of it is that the government does not privatize what it had promised. But the fear was that extra issuance in the bond and in the equity market will drive down equity prices. Did we protect equity market? Not really. Equity prices dropped almost like 24-25% last year. We lost out on growth. We lost out on lower inflation. We lost out on lower interest rate because of the government's inability to manage the windfall gain properly. It was in this context that we were looking at this year's budget. If this year, and there was an enormous amount of pressure, even as Mr. Vinod Rai talked about, just look at the op-eds that have been written, 2 months before the budget. 9 out of 10 op-eds was exhorting the government that growth is still weak. We still need more public investment. Let's break the promise of 3.5% and let's add some more in public investment. The problem would have been the following, that this will be the second year in which Finance Minister will have to go to Parliament and to the world and say, well, okay, fine, I did promise I was going to bring down the deficit to 3.5% last year, but you know what? Global growth is again very weak. So let me postpone it for 1 more year. If he had done that, the credibility of this government in managing fiscal consolidation would have been seriously questioned. And the question that would have been risen was that if this government cannot consolidate the budget, cannot cut deficit when oil is at $30 a barrel, when can it? Can it ever, in that case, ever manage to cut down the deficit? So that was the first problem. The second problem was that we tried it. We have done fiscal stimulus back in 2009, 10, 11, and 12. And in 13, we paid the price for it with a almost near balance of payments crisis. So it wasn't that, we used fiscal policy long time back in 81, 82, or in 91, 92, and then that's when we got into a crisis. Those memories have gone away. This was just 5 years back. 2009, we increased the budget deficit by 3% of GDP in the pretext that this was a global crisis, and we refused to cut it in 2010, 11, and 12. 2013, we faced a near crisis with current account deficit going up to almost 5.5% of GDP. So it isn't that we haven't tried it. We've tried boosting growth with fiscal stimulus. Almost always, it has ended in tears. And the last bit, and this is where I think there is a sort of a structural difference, and there's a difference in the way the government is thinking about growth or the global economy, and perhaps the way we are thinking, or I'm thinking about the global economy, is that, and I'm going to go out on a limb and say something that I'm sure all of you will disagree, is that public investment isn't India's problem right now. India's problem is that corporate investors haven't invested anything for the last 4 years. Every year, corporate investment has fallen. Corporate investment was the key to the 2003-2008 7, 8, 9% growth rate. That's the reason why we have been falling, why our growth rate has been falling, although again, CSO numbers will not reveal that. Corporate investment has turned negative for 3 straight years. I haven't come across any corporate who has said, you know what, I'm not building this extra biscuit factory because there is no public investment, or there's no public infrastructure, or I can't find land, or cost of capital is too high. The uniform concern that every corporate has as to why corporates haven't done any investment or any capital investment over the last 3 years is because there is no visibility of demand. The argument last year was that, look, if we do public investment and then the private investment will be crowded in. Well, we did public investment, and private investment just shrugged it off and said, that's not good enough. The real problem facing India, facing China, facing Singapore, facing the entire world is a lack of demand. There is pointless for any corporate to look at what's happening in China, the amount of excess capacity Chinese industry has, and say, you know what, let me add to the excess capacity in the globe by putting up another plant in India. The only way in which, whether it's a foreign direct investor or a domestic investor is going to invest in India or anywhere else in the world, is if the person is assured that there is some visibility of demand, given the huge amount of excess capacity that is on the global scale at this point in time. Therefore, what the government needs to do is stop worrying about public investment and start worrying about private consumption. So what is it that holds back India's private consumption? There is rural stress, and rural distress is very important. Mr. Rai talked about it. 2 consecutive drought has had its toll. But a much bigger problem in India is that you have a situation where mostly urban middle class, about 150 million of them, if you look at their house, if you look at the savings rate is astronomically high. And again, I know that I'm talking to a bunch of Asians who love savings and hates consumption. But think about why are Indians saving? They're saving either because of the children's education, or about their daughter's wedding, or about their own healthcare, or about their housing. Two of them, education and healthcare, the out-of-pocket expenses is astronomically high in India. And much of India's saving is precautionary savings to worry about what your children's education is going to be and what your own healthcare expenses are going to be. India is a country where if I go and buy a healthcare product, the liability is not with the insurance company. The insurance company's liability is capped to, like, say, 5 lakh rupees. The entire residual liability lies on me, the individual, which means that I have no idea what my triple bypass is going to cost me when I'm 65 years old. And consequently, the precautionary savings is astronomically high. So if India has to go and turn around and create an alternative source of demand, a source of demand that does not depend upon global export growth, which has been languishing for the last 3 years, then it has to turn to domestic consumption. And for that, it has to address two issues: public investment in health and public investment in education. That's where the largest out-of-pocket expenses are. I'm not saying that you shouldn't do motherhood and apple pie and not build bridges and roads. I mean, you do build bridges and roads. Those are all good things. But that's not the problem of 2016. That was the problem of 2013. So the view is that you cannot go and put a little bit of public investment here, there, break the budget deficit by 0.3, 0.4% of GDP, make the equity market happy, and you can get growth. You can't get growth. The only way you can get growth is by actually transforming the focus of the budget away from this obsession India has with public investment. And to be fair, this budget did move in some direction towards addressing public health and education, but clearly not enough, and to preserve macroeconomic stability. And for that, it was imperative that the finance minister had to resist the massive amount of pressure, both within the government and outside the government, that was being placed on him to break the promise one more time. And I'm glad that, unlike last year, this year I can actually go out and say, given the circumstances, this was a very bold move by the finance ministry. That the finance minister actually stood up and said, you know what, I know the world is falling apart around me, but I'm still going to stick with macroeconomic stability, and I'm going to choose to take on 3.5. Now comes the big question that Mr. Rai pointed out. Does 3.5 add up? There are lots of quibbles about 3.5. I will give you two of them. One is that there is a very large assumption that India is going to, the amount of spectrum sales, 4G sales, and the divestment proceeds are going to be met. It's a very, very large amount, 0.7% of GDP. We have never done 0.7% of GDP. Chances are we will struggle with 3.5. But at least we will struggle with 3.5 9 months down the road, rather than today. If the government had actually gone and listened to the fiscal doves and did a 3.7%, 3.8% fiscal deficit, none of the things that Mr. Rai talked about in the equity markets would be true. The rupee would be struggling today to keep around 70, and the 10-year bond rate would have risen much more than it has. I'm going to stop here.
Thank you, Jahangir. Thank you for that lovely exposition. Now we have Mr. Vikram Khanna.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. A very stimulating presentation by Jahangir and Mr. Rai. I'm not sure I agree with everything you said, but that's good. Let me just start with what I know that Mr. Rai and yourself both referred to this pre-budget debate on where to peg, how fast fiscal consolidation should proceed. And I have to say that my sympathies lay with the group that said there's no hurry to go straight from 3.9 to 3.5. This is we have inflation, wholesale inflation is 0 to negative. CPI inflation is 5%. The global environment, there's no stimulus from the global environment. What is the hurry of to consolidate by 4.4 percentage points in one shot? I would have been more sympathetic to the view that we can go a little more gradually. I do not think it would have created a crisis of confidence, and I think there would still be room for the RBI to cut interest rates. Okay, on the deficit. This was of course predictably a farmer's budget, a very pro-farmer budget after 2 bad monsoons, as Mr. Rai mentioned. Lots of rural distress, almost 0 growth in agriculture over the last couple of years, including 1 year of negative growth, farmer suicides and all this. And so they had to do this. And there's also elections coming up in 5 states, including some big ones, Tamil Nadu, West Bengal, and I think next May it'll be UP, and so even politically this makes a lot of sense. I think one of the benefits of being slower to cut the deficit would have been to keep up the momentum on infrastructure. Capital spending growth has slowed down, is going to slow down this year. Partly this reflects the demands of the 7th Pay Commission, which have partially been addressed. That money has to go there, and partly, of course, money going to the farm sector. But still, I think a slower pace of deficit reduction could have permitted more to go for infrastructure. As for growth, I completely agree with Jahangir. They have to address the demand issue, but part of the answer to that is public investment in health and education. I think that would help address the demand issue. But I think it's a very important aspect that I think Mr. Rai referred to. I think Jahangir has written about this, but he didn't have time to raise it, which is the state of the banking system. I think, as Mr. Rai mentioned, 25,000 crores is pitiful compared to what banks really need. Fitch has put a figure of 100,000 crores over and above what is needed to meet Basel III requirements. You have NPLs in the banking system of state-owned banks in excess of 5%. Some banks are at 10%. I should say that not only state-owned banks are guilty. I mean, ICICI Bank has had a couple of bad years. Standard Chartered Bank is at the same level as some pretty bad state-owned banks. DBS also had a terrible year last year, but I think they've cleaned up their act now. The NPLs have come down a little bit. But I think this is a serious problem. Banks are just not able to fund major projects. Projects are held up, including infrastructure. I think, there's something like 400,000 crores of debt held up, stuck in the debt tribunals that have yet to be recovered. Now, banks are also facing huge problems with their portfolio restructuring. I interviewed Arundhati Bhattacharya sometime in September. Let me tell you what she told me. He said, if a private bank has to unload some bad debt, somebody comes and makes an offer for 70 paisa on the rupee, you can call a board meeting, you can decide, and you can do it. If this happens in the case of a state-owned bank, they have to set up a committee and have an auction with a reserve price. If that reserve price is not met, they have to set up another committee and have another auction. And then, only then, if that is not met, only then can they go back to the private party and say, all right. Just imagine the sort of difficulty these people have with just unloading the debt, and of course the lack of a bankruptcy law, the lack of exit mechanisms, all that stuff. On infrastructure, I would say this. I think the infrastructure banks, we are overly dependent on banks to finance infrastructure. Our infrastructure financing institutions are too few and too small. IDFC has become a bank. You don't really have major, large infrastructure financing. Pension funds and provident funds are not able to do infrastructure financing. Why? Because they can only invest in AA rated, minimum AA rated projects, and if you're a new project, it's very hard to get a AA rating. So I think these are the sort of some of the big issues that need to be addressed. I think some of these are not budget related. Some of these are related to things like the bankruptcy law, which is in the works, and I don't know when it's going to happen, if it's going to happen. I agree also with Jahangir on especially the health. Our spending, public spending on health is pitiful. It's like 1.5% of GDP. Even China spends upwards of 3% of GDP. OECD average is 6.4% of GDP. So I think I think the left-wing economists have a point. People like Amartya Sen have a point. And unless you really address this issue, you're not going to be able to deal with not just rural but even urban distress, and you're not going to be able to address the demand problem. But just to close, I think the three really big. I agree with Chidambaram when he says there's no big idea in the budget, but the reason for that is partly his party's fault. The big ideas are, I'd say three. One is the GST, and that is a big idea that has still to happen. There was hope that it would happen by April 1st this year, but that's not to be, partly thanks to the Congress party, which itself mooted the GST. The second big idea is, as I mentioned, the bankruptcy law, which is still in the works. And the third big idea, I think, which has to be still clear is, and partly the Congress party is again a spoiler here, is the Land Acquisition Act, which is basically the reason why the majority of projects are held up, at least 40%. The single biggest reason for the holding up of projects in India. And these are the things that are compromising growth. And I think once we have these three things cleared, I think there's a good chance that we could go upwards of 8% growth. And I think, as for this year, if there's a good monsoon, I think, and given the extent of spending in rural India, and if we have a rate cut, all of which is possible, I think it could be a bonanza here, especially for rural India. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Vikram. Thank you for that silver lining. We move on to Rohan, tax expert.
Thank you, Dr. Jahangir, Vikram, Mr. Rai. Whilst my earlier speaker spoke on a macroeconomy basis or economic basis, I'm going to talk on tax. Because at the end of it, I look at it from what's going to hit my profit and loss account, what's the money I'm going to take out, and what's the tax I'm going to pay. So keeping that in mind, and whilst I can keep on going talking about tax changes that have happened or have not happened, I'm going to pick on 5 or 6 items which I think are pretty critical and important that have been introduced in this budget. Like the earlier speaker said, this is not a big bang budget, even from a tax perspective. In the past, there have always been sort of a lot of hype about tax changes that are going to come about, tax rates are going to be dropped. But this time, he's made 2 or 3 important changes and a multiple number of small changes. 2 things that really stand out in this entire budget from a tax perspective. I think, and he repeated that very often in his speech. Firstly is rationalization, simplification of tax laws, and to bring about certainty and predictability in the way the tax system operates in India. That's a statement of intent, and I think that's a good statement. At least it's coming out, he said it last time, he's coming back again and saying that at least he's reiterating it and trying to demonstrate a little bit of confidence that he wants to bring into the Western world to say, we will have a predictable regime of tax. The second thing he also spoke about very often in this budget is simplification and rationalization. And towards that end, he has made some amount of changes as to how the tax authorities are going to look at taxation and trying to deal with taxpayers. So those are the two broad overarching sort of sentiments that he's brought about. So coming back into a little bit more specific details, I'll leave with you 3 or 4 big ideas that he's done, and a couple of which he did not do and which could have an adverse impact. The first one is rationalization of tax rates. Last year, he said that he's going to drop the tax rates down to 25%. He's dropped 1 percentage point down from 30 to 29 for certain small companies. But what he's also introduced is a new tax rate of 25% for new domestic companies which are engaged in manufacturing activity from April 1, 2016. Of course, that 25% needs to be topped up with the education cess and the surcharge that is there. So, your effective tax rate might be at 28%, but if I look at it from a 30% including surcharge and cess, which was a 34%, it's now coming down to about 28%. So there is a reduction of about 5 or 5.5 percentage points. One can come back and argue to say, why am I doing this for new manufacturing companies? Why haven't I done it for old companies? So is it a benefit that you're giving only the new manufacturing or new companies or new entrants into this market? You're not, so is it a way of penalizing the old? But mind you, this rate of 25%, you can elect for it, provided you don't opt for any of these incentives that are there, which is, having a manufacturing facility in a SEZ, or trying to claim enhanced R&D deductions or accelerated depreciation. So the 25% rate is there if you give up your other allowances. That's the first, I think, in the context of rationalization of tax rates. I think it's a good move. It's demonstrating intent that I want to bring tax rates down. Whether that happens now, he did say last year he's going to do it over a 5-year period, so at least this demonstrates the intent. And I will keep on coming back to intent because when you look at tax, if I have to go back a couple of years when after the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Vodafone, the law was changed retrospectively, India had pretty much taken a flack and a beating for the way that we used to look at taxes. This time round, they want to bring about stability, rationalization, ease of doing business in India. So intent is always important when you look at it from a tax policy perspective. The second big change that he's brought about is something called an equalization levy. Now, what is this equalization levy all about? So when you look at OECD, and OECD in the context of trying to define how companies operate in this digital world and who should have the right to tax and where should the tax be paid. So very simply, you look at a company like Google. So Google Ireland basically may have the website, the server, everything, and a person sitting in India might access that. So Google India might be owned, that website may be owned by Ireland. A person sitting in India will get onto the Google website, start surfing. That data is collected by Google. They will then do their analytics on it and say, hey, you're in this age group of 30 to 40, you're looking at doing a holiday in Rajasthan, and next time you get onto the net or you get onto Google, there'll be a website that pops up, hotel stay in Rajasthan, travel stay in Rajasthan. So all of this income, or all of this advertising income that is there, which should be taxed in India, is not getting taxed in India. So what have they done? They've come back and tried to do a mechanism, and which is well established by OECD now under the BEPS, which is the base erosion and profit shifting mechanism. They've come back and said, or not said, but they've said that countries can adopt this mechanism whereby they try to levy a tax on it. This is called, what is called in the OECD world, a novel idea. So it's defined in OECD and BEPS called novel. And India is, I think, one of the first countries to come back and levy this. So which means that every company in India, which is an advertising company, it's on a B2B basis, which avails of this and makes a payment to a non-resident, so in our case, Google Ireland, they will have to pay a 6% levy on the payment that they make. So it's like a withholding tax, but it's not a tax. It's called an equalization levy. And I'll tell you the significance of it. So when Google Ireland raises its invoice of 100, they have two options now. So let's say it raises an invoice on an advertising company in India. The advertising company can withhold 6 and pay 94, or Google has the option of raising an invoice of 106, and the Indian company will pay accordingly 6% of that and remit 100 back. Because this is not introduced as an income tax, but under a separate levy under the finance bill, the foreign company cannot claim any tax credit on it. It is not an income tax. So I can't even go into the tax treaty to say I want to claim a foreign tax credit. This is going to be a cost of doing business nowadays. It's more like an anti-avoidance rule that was looked at. And therefore, under normal principles of anti-avoidance rules, they will come back and say that you need to pay this tax. India has the right to levy it, and you will not have the right to claim any foreign tax credits on it. So that's, again, now what's going to be the success of it? Mind you, he has not put a number to this as to what he estimates collection in terms of revenues that are going to come out of this. It's all just said that we want to and we will introduce an equalization levy. Interesting concept. So that was the second big thing that we did. The third big item, to my mind, is somewhat similar introduction of a patent box, which is to say that if you've got technology or if you've got an intellectual property right which is developed and patented in India, then all income arising from that patent will be taxed at 10%. So let's take a look at pharma companies. So pharma companies can go ahead and develop all of their, whatever patents they want or formulations, and they go back and register those patents in India. They can start exploiting that patent and get a royalty income on that. That royalty income, under the normal circumstances, would get taxed at 30%. Now they are saying that we will give you a concessional tax rate of 10%, provided it is patented, developed, and that patent is registered in India. Again, a good concept. So look at our pharma company example. I then now have a deduction which I can get for research and development. So my normal R&D expenditure is still being allowed as a deduction. The income against that, so that deduction is at 30% under normal corporate tax rates in India. The income which I will derive from that in future will get taxed at 10%. Good concept, novel. I think it's keeping in line with the government philosophy of Make in India, Startup India. So keeping in line with Mr. Modi's policy, this seems to be a good move. The fourth big area that he's come about is the amnesty scheme. So it's like a voluntary disclosure scheme for Indians. He had something in the past for non-resident or foreign Indians. And I say foreign Indians means Indians living overseas, and under the disclosure scheme. Wasn't a big success when he introduced that. Hopefully this will be more successful. This is for Indian domestic residents living in India. He's come back and said, anyone who has not paid tax or who has got quote unquote black money in India, you now have the option of coming clean, pay a 30% tax, on top of which we will have another 7.5% interest, on top of which we will have another 7.5% penalty, which means total cost 45%, no questions asked, come clean. Whether this is going to, how many people are going to take this up, I don't know. The last scheme was not very successful. Again, he has not attributed any number which he estimates from it. But yeah, from the look of it, I think it might be a pretty good uptake on it. Hopefully it will go towards financing some of those numbers that are missing in there. He's spoken about 2 or 3 things from a policy, or an FDI policy perspective, which means investment into India. He's permitted 100% investment into marketing companies, for which are marketing food products which are manufactured or produced in India. Good move. Hopefully it will help the farmers get a better price and earn more money out of that. But the concept, and I liked one of the statements that he made in the budget, that we are now constantly looking throughout the whole 12-month period as to how we can introduce new policies, whether it's through the RBI, whether it's through the FDI policy. So it's not a single one-time event, it's over a period of time that we will continue doing this. Now, whether there is a limited FDI permitted into stock exchanges, that limit has been raised from 5 to 15, or whether it's in this, or whether it's opening up of foreign FDI or foreign investment into airports, ports. Ports, for example, there are 5 new ports on the eastern as well as the western side which have already been looked at, identified, and which will get opened up. I'm sure PSA will be interested in some of them, if not all. Startups, he's given an incentive again for startups, where he's come back and said that tax profits for 3 years or a 5-year period will be exempt. Whilst that's a good move, the one thing I'm a little unhappy or disappointed about, if I look at a typical startup, most of the uptake that comes out is either through sweat equity or stock options. And that income gets taxed as compensation income in India at the first stage. He hasn't done anything to change that level of taxation. So whilst he's given the exemption for companies at a profit level and exempting the profit, he really hasn't given any exemption to the promoters or to key stakeholders who may actually take their compensation by way of sweat equity or stock options. That will continue to get taxed at the maximum marginal rates. The last point I would like to make is, and this is a small point, but it impacts pretty much the R.K. Lakshman person who is a common man. He has now introduced a mechanism which says that 60% of contributions which are made into Provident Fund after April 1, 2016 will be taxed upon withdrawal. So which means that at the end of your working life, all your contributions after April 1, 2016, 60% of that will get taxed. I don't know why he's done that. The rationale or the principle behind it is to bring about rationality and to align it with the other Provident Fund schemes. But mind you, this is a salaried man that we are talking about. He's the common man, and you are taxing 60% of his earnings on withdrawal. So I'll leave you with some of these thoughts that are there, but overall I think it's pretty much a balanced budget, no big bang. Whether Vodafone will get settled, Kane Energy tax demands will get settled is beyond the tax officer. It's beyond any sort of public policy that will come through a budget. It will happen at the country or whatever level it has to via negotiation and dialogue. But I'll leave you with these points. I'm happy to take any questions later once we finish. Thank you.
Thank you, Rohan. On the tax part of the budget, now we have our last speaker and this for the day, Dr. Amitendu Palit.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rai. And what I'll do after this very wide canvas that we have covered is to focus on one particular perspective on the budget which has been relatively less discussed in the discussion that we had today, but which has been a crying demand from the finance minister and the Modi government right from the beginning. That is economic reforms. How does this budget look from the perspective of economic reforms? But before coming to that, let me share with you one aside. We take the budget, as Mr. Rai mentioned, as the greatest economic show that India produces each year unfailingly. It's the finance minister's big day. The visitors' gallery in the parliament is all studded and packed up, and there's an enormous amount of activity that goes on in the North Block from where both Mr. Rai and I come, including preparation of halwas for marking of the budget, printing of papers and so on and so forth. But in reality, the finance minister actually has discretionary control on only 1/4 of the resources that he handles in the budget. 75% of the resources that he puts in are actually pre-decided. These are for repayment of loans, transfer of funds to states, and salaries and wages and pensions that are to be given out. The correct figure is 78.3%, but I was being charitable and made it 75%. So whatever political capital he has to secure and economic trick he has to pull off is with the remaining 25% of the resources that he has at his disposal. Now, having said that, we talked about mathematics in the beginning. We talked about the fact that he faced this issue of sticking to fiscal discipline, tackling the rural distress growing out in the country after 2 successive years of droughts. He has been the finance minister of the party which has been facing election debacles over the whole of last year. So he couldn't have done something which was politically very unpopular. He had to take measures which would be politically acceptable yet would make good economic sense, and that's what budgets in India are all. So what he did was, and this is where I'm looking at the revenue side. If one looks at the arithmetic, the share from where the revenues are coming in, the biggest increase has been in non-tax revenues, and Jahangir alluded to it, so did Mr. Rai. That the expectation is that there are 3 categories which will fetch much more than what they did in the previous year. One is the central public sector enterprises would produce higher dividends, which is based on the assumption that they would perform better in the current year, have more surplus, and as a result would give fatter checks to the Ministry of Finance. But the more critical assumption is the spectrum earnings, the telecom spectrum earnings, and the coal and new energy licensing exploration policy for energy resources. Now, we will not go into the details of whether they are possible or not, but this is a bit of a thread on which he has taken a risk and turn out to be a double-edged sword. The core issue is that did he address or could he meet the fundamental expectation before going into the budget, and which I think I will not be wrong if I put it as the core fundamental concern, that was increasing investments to make India actually look like a 7.6% economy that the statistical numbers are projecting. Well, I think what he did under the circumstances, given the fact that he could not have been politically unpopular, could not have gone big bang, there was a resource constraint, the Finance Commission has cut the amount of cake for him to a much smaller slice. He can't claim as much from the central pool of taxes as he could have earlier. I think what he did was, he tried to, and this is what I think is the positive part of the budget, he tried to leave some strong signals. I'm not too sure whether this will be implementable in the remaining years that he has as the finance minister, if he at all remains the finance minister. But I think these are signals which would be there for the next finance ministers to take forward. One of this, Rohan alluded to this, 100% FDI in marketing of in marketing of food products produced and manufactured in India. Now, if you look at this very carefully, this is actually 100% FDI in food product retail. The word retail has never been mentioned. He has been careful not to make it a political issue. But if you go back and if you look at the FDI policy, there is 100% FDI in cash and carry trade, in commission agency, and in wholesale trade. These are the 3 components of distribution services which currently allow 100% FDI in India. What doesn't is multi-brand retail. So no multi-brand, no retail. But what is left? What is left is marketing. And the biggest opposition to retail marketing actually in India has come from the food product segment. Because that's where the largest number of domestic organized retail players are, as well as the informal sectors. So this he took as an intelligent measure under the broad umbrage of making a budget for the rural sector. And if there were those of you who noticed the parliament reaction to this, you might have noticed one spirited lady cheering this proposal from the background, Mrs. Harsimrat Kaur Badat, one of the allies of the BJP in the parliament. So it got a thumbs up. He mentioned another important factor. He can't do anything over the Land Acquisition Act now. It's with the Select Committee of the Parliament. But he did say that the modernization of land records program in the country will be completely revamped, which I think is the beginning to at least setting the land records straight in the country, because before purchasing land in India, one has to know who that land belongs to. And there's no clear evidence of that because the title deeds are not available. So at least the land records have to be preserved, digitized, and made known to the parties of a transaction as to who is the empowered authority to buy and sell a particular piece of land. The third, he mentioned about opening up the Motor Vehicles Act in India for the transport sector in the passenger segment. Now, for those of you who are familiar with with driving in India, having owned cars in India and having traveled in India, you know that a privately registered car in India cannot be used for commercial purposes. What implications does this have for the Uber? Profound implications. What implications does this have for self-driven rental cars? Can they be put on rent in the first place? These are unanswered questions, and these are regulatory changes which are absolutely must if India's urbanization has to be managed in an efficient way. At least the whole talk about smart cities will collapse unless and until the Motor Vehicles Act is amended to give greater space to flexible use of vehicles. I think he has been reasonably good in trying to bring a clearer air when it comes to the public-private partnership projects, because he mentioned about introducing a resolution of disputes bill for public utilities, which has been one of the issues holding up many public-private partnership projects, and of course renegotiation of these projects. And I think interestingly, he spoke about introducing a system where infrastructure projects would be credit rated. That, I think, is a very good signal as far as the banks are concerned, because they can now, on the basis of these ratings, done by informed and capable agencies, pick up the projects whom they can identify for on-rate. In India, an important issue, I think this is something which many of us have talked about, is that when one looks at incentives given to businesses, there has never been any incentive given for employment generation. All incentives are given to businesses for capital use. Greater capital use always is backed by fiscal incentives, depreciation allowance, so on and so on. Never any incentive for employing more people. For the first time, a very cautious beginning. And that beginning is the center taking over the Employee Provident Fund contribution of 8.33% of the employer for the first 3 years of new employees. Well, at least now startups will not be able to immediately complain that they don't want to become a part of the formal sector because they have to bear the provident fund liabilities of new employees. At least they don't have to for the first 3 years. So let's see what happens. I don't know whether any of my colleagues mentioned this, but there is a mention of the budget of the general insurance companies to be listed on the stock exchanges of India. Again, I think has important implications when it comes to inflow of foreign funds. And now I, in this context, come to my last reforms point, which I think is very, very significant and a very big hint dropped by the finance minister. People have been unhappy. In fact, Mr. Rai and I were watching the budget together, and we kind of were trying to speculate how much money the minister might allot for recapitalization of the public sector banks. Obviously, what he allotted, 25,000 crore, is much, much less than what is required and what was expected. But I think to me, it's not the number. What is important is a single sentence which he mentioned, that there will be steps taken to take measures to bring down the government equity in IDBI Bank to below 50%. Now, this can start off what I would call not privatization but denationalization of public sector banks in India. I think if the government can pull this off in this year or over the next year, it will be a very, very important step in the structural transformation of the public sector banks in India. I will end on a slightly cynical note because I want to go back to two risks and two signals which he dropped, which, unlike some of the positive signals that I shared with you, are none too positive as far as I am concerned. The first is, I think I fully agree with Jahangir, the success of the budget was sticking to the fiscal consolidation target of 3.5%, irrespective of the mathematics. But the danger is that he slipped in this condition that he would urge a review of the Fiscal Review and Budget Management Act to see that if there could be departures made from it in the future. I don't think this is a great signal to come. What that essentially means is that the spectrum of opinions who think that India should, as a rational economic policy, deviate from fiscal consolidation is increasingly gaining ground. And he leaves room over the next couple of years to actually deviate from the targets if this kind of a review comes in. So I think that's a danger. And the final danger. If we just go back to what he started the budget with, the budget actually began before it was presented. The budget began the day before the budget was presented in the Prime Minister's rally in UP, where he said the next day, I'm going to be judged by 125 million people because my exam comes tomorrow. And he said that my aim is to increase rural incomes, double rural incomes from what they are over the next 7 years. So by 2022, farmer incomes in India should double. So this kind of pretty well indicated what the budget is going to be all about. Now the point is, this is what the budget started with, doubling farmers' incomes in 7 years' time. I think the biggest sort of comment on this actually came from Dr. Manmohan Singh, who simply said that what this means arithmetically is a 14% increase in the average farmer's incomes every year for the next 7 years, which is unthinkable. He didn't say undoable, he said it is unthinkable. Now, I think what has happened here is that this is a very hot political potato, which the budget has tried to pull off. Because now this will be the benchmark of expectations. Farmers' incomes are expected to increase at a substantive rate, so much so in 7 years' time, they become double of what they are. And if this is something which gets ingrained in the spectrum of expectations, then obviously the expectations from government become very different than what they were in the beginning of the budget. The problem over here is the government does not seem to have any solution to increasing farmer incomes in the short term other than ramping up the Rural Employment Guarantee Program, which incidentally, according to Government of India statistics, is not treated as employment. It's simply treated as consumption increase. The National Sample Survey Organization does not take employment under this program as employment. So I think if that is the way to double farmers' incomes, our best wishes for the finance minister and the government. Thank you.